Good morning or good afternoon. Hey guys, and welcome to another lesson. We're talking about the various different kingdoms of life. And today, of course, we are going to go ahead and talk about the awesome animal kingdom. For a lot of you guys, I know this will be your favorite kingdom, and I know my opinion that plants are the coolest kingdom is not the most popular, but also I have to admit that when we're going through kingdoms, I mean, plants and animals, just really every kingdom is so full of amazing and incredible life, but the animal kingdom definitely has some stuff that rivals the plants in terms of coolness, I'll admit it. And today that's what we're going to talk about. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive in to this incredible world. So what is an animal? When you think about it, you're like, oh, that seems pretty easy. It's a thing that moves. And actually, that is one of the things that oftentimes people cite because, you know, so many of the other kingdoms that we can see with our naked eyes, like the fungi and plantae and things like that, they don't move. And so oftentimes, you know, we think, yeah, animals are the things that move. But technically, animals are multicellular eukaryotes. They have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Unlike plants, they have no cell walls, so their cells are more globular or oftentimes are depicted as being round, though they aren't always literally round. Um, Many of them possess some sort of internal or external framework that muscles are attached to that allow for the movement to occur. So there's that movement piece. But one really distinctive characteristic is that all are heterotrophs. You're not going to find autotrophs producers in this kingdom. There's just not going to be here. And that's really interesting because a lot of the other kingdoms, in fact, most of the other kingdoms, you know, fungi are not included along with Animalia, but most of the others have some sort of autotrophic function, an ability to make their food, whether through chemosynthesis or photosynthesis. So it's interesting that animals don't do that. So they're entirely dependent upon other organisms for their energy. And that's going to play a big role in some of their key features later on. So animals first came from the ocean, just like plants. When they arose from the oceans, of course, they had to develop features very much like plants had to develop features to be able to survive on land. So you have to think about in the water, a lot of these animals were kind of supported by the water, because you know if you've ever gotten in the water, you know you feel a bit lighter. The water's sort of supporting you if you're buoyant, if you can float. And so they had to develop thicker bones to be able to support legs and lungs and all that sort of stuff. They also had to, you know, a lot of them developed eyesight so that they could be able to see and navigate around those structures and look for predators and everything else like that. Their bodies had to change in terms of adaptations for being able to look around, like their heads had to become distinct from the rest of their bodies, etc. So all that cool stuff we learned about with Tiktaalik had to occur in order for animals to be able to come down to land. Animals first evolved actually way back from amoeba-like cells, so protist-like cells. And we know that this makes sense because protists we often depict as being sort of the root of all those eukaryotic kingdoms. We know that protists were the kind of the last to split off before they diversified into all these different kingdoms. So it makes sense that animals would come from a protist-like or amoeba-like entity. That was about 800 million years ago during what's called the Precambrian era. It wasn't until 400 million years after, so 400 million years ago, that we actually saw the first animals start to come out onto land. Of course, by the time that they did this, plants had already diversified across the surface of the Earth. At the cellular level, again, animal cells are globular or roundish. They lack those cell walls, large central vacuoles, or chloroplasts that you would find in plant or in plant or in protist cells. They don't have those vacuoles, mostly because they don't have to perform photosynthesis. So when you look inside of an animal cell, you're going to see the nucleus is probably the biggest thing, followed by the endoplasmic reticulum, and then your mitochondria. And that's really because, again, we don't have any autosome, any sort of autotrophic functions. And so what we're really looking at with animals is we don't need a giant storehouse for sugar or for water that plants need because they perform photosynthesis. So we can kind of get rid of all the storage supplies and just go ahead and focus on having mitochondria, which are going to be those organelles that are going to break down the sugars that we get in the proteins and everything else that we get from other organisms. um, along with our lysosomes. They're both the mitochondria and the lysosomes are going to work together to break down all that stuff into energy in the form of ATP that we can use to move around. So we don't need the giant storehouse organelles. All we need are the organelles that are involved in metabolism and breaking down the components that we need to make our energy. Here we can see some animal cells. Sorry, my brain's all over the place. Some animal cells over here. We can see this one's actually undergoing metaphase right here. It's going through that cell process, and this one's going through anaphase. It's pulling apart. This looks like prophase. So cool. You can see all these little phases of mitosis happening in all of these animal cells. It's kind of neat. Okay, so movement. Animals are motile, most of them. Now, some of them, like oysters, are going to be what we call sedimentary or static. But those organisms that can't move around a whole lot usually start off as being a moving organism. So oftentimes the little larval forms of those organisms will actually swim around to the destination where they'll spend the rest of their lives. So even then, animals are motile. A lot of animals use muscles. Some are going to use just contractions of those muscles to propel themselves. Some will actually use muscles to produce air pressure that they'll actually sort of squirt themselves through the water. There are all sorts of ways that they can move around in search for food. Now this is important because they're heterotrophs, they can't make their own food, they have to go seek it out throughout the environment, and so movement is one of the ways in which they've adapted to better handle that necessity. The other interesting thing though is that movement may be related to the evolution of complex thought and sight. Maybe they didn't lead to each other, but maybe they supported one another and became fitter when they were together. Sight allowed organisms to be able to see movement and potential prey or incoming predators. It also allowed them to better navigate through their environment. And then thought, if you think about it, when you're walking around, when you are going around places, you sort of use your sight to be able to tell where you're going to go. But when you imagine going someplace as well, you can kind of anticipate those obstacles. And so the anticipation of those obstacles, the anticipation of where an organism is going to be if it continues to run in the next 3 seconds, if you're tracking prey or something, may have been related to our ability to think more complexly and use tools like imagination and things like that. So gaining energy, again, all animals are heterotrophs. Now, we usually divide them into 3 main sections, which are herbivores that only eat plants, carnivores that only eat meat, and omnivores that eat both plants and animals. Now, that's really cool because, some when we think about it, like, before we were able to talk about autotroph, heterotroph, mixotroph, heteroautotroph, like all these crazy things. Here we're just, we're actually showing how animals over time have adapted to, specializing in various different types of organisms to get their energy from. And I think that's really fascinating and evolutionarily very important because the animals that have adapted to eat plants and vegetation have very different digestive tracts and very different mutualistic associations with organisms in order to break down those plant structures versus animals that primarily rely upon meat. So those show incredible diversity in terms of the animal's ability to gain energy from their food. We also have animals engaging in all sorts of symbiotic relationships. So this includes mutualism, where both benefit. So this is like the clownfish and the sea anemone. The clownfish tricks other fish into coming down and touching the stinging tentacles on the sea anemone. And the sea anemone, which is a cnidarian, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is going to provide a little bit of food, to the clownfish, and so they're going to help one another. Commensalism is like this cattle egret. It's not going to do anything to help the cow, but it's not hurting the cow either. The cow's looking at it like, oh, I have a bird on my back, and the bird's like, yep. Hello. The bird is kind of waiting to look around for frogs and stuff that the bird likes to eat. So it's using the cow as a perch, but it's not hurting the cow. It's helping the egret. Therefore, it's commensalism. One benefits the other one. It doesn't really matter. And then parasitism. Many animals can also act as parasites, where one benefits and one is harmed. So like mosquitoes and all that other stuff. Those are animals that come down and they bite into you and suck your blood. Now it's weird to think about a mosquito as being an animal, as well as like ticks or leeches and things like that. But they are all animals, and that's one of the things that is really impressive when you start to think about the animal kingdom, is just how diverse these animal forms really are. Animal reproduction is mostly sexual, although there are some organisms, some animals that reproduce asexually, which is really cool. Or they can switch back and forth, sort of like that alternation of generations we talked about before. That switch back and forth can again just be due to the necessity of the environment. If the environment is rapidly changing, then maybe the organism is going to want to have a sexual reproduction so that it can increase genetic diversity, or maybe it would want an asexual reproduction to make sure it could keep its numbers up so it wouldn't go extinct. So it just really depends on what the organism's needs are in the moment and how many resources it's privy to. But a lot of organisms, a lot of animals cannot actually reproduce asexually. Like people, we can't just glom off each other and reproduce asexually. Although I guess well, even with cloning, we don't have artificial wombs yet that are able to support that kind of thing. So yeah, so far, not even artificially, we can't even do that asexually. So we have to reproduce sexually. And the generation times, though, can really vary. So, like mice reproduce really, really fast, and cats reproduce really fast. Whereas for a human, it takes us quite a while to reach reproductive age, and then, many people wait until far after their reproductive age to actually, reproduce and have a family. So generation times vary. The slower the generation time, of course, the slower the mutation rate and all that kind of thing. The combination of sperm and egg is going to create a zygote. So this is really important. All of the sperm and egg, like we talked about before, are haploid. So they have one set of chromosomes. And with us, our typical cells, and most typical cells, are going to be diploid. So they're going to have two of each chromosome, one inherited from mom, one inherited from dad. And so the combination of a haploid sperm and an egg is going to create a diploid zygote that develops either outside in eggs or something, or inside the womb of one of the parents. It's typically the female, but again, there's a lot of variation. I'm sure you guys have heard of male seahorses, carrying young and stuff. The zygote, after the sperm and the egg have come together, they form into that diploid body cell, and it begins to divide rapidly into a big ball of cells, and that's called the zygote, and that will eventually develop into the embryo. And then a fetus, and then of course it's going to be born from either an egg or from a parent. The best life cycle of an animal that I could find was this, which is just absolutely absurd. I was Googling images, and of course, probably the safe search from the school computer was on, but I was just like, what? Are you serious? This is the best animal life cycle that I could actually get, and it's terrible. The drawings are creepy and weird, and I don't know, I don't like it. But this does show that in animal life cycle, typically we're going to have the egg and the sperm form together into the zygote embryo, then the child grows up, reaches reproductive age, and eventually has children again. So it's the animal life cycle, and looks very different than the life cycles we've been looking at with the alternation of generations and all that kind of stuff. The major animal phyla. So the animal kingdom is split into 9 major phyla, although typically, if you're asking somebody officially, it's made out of 36 animal phyla. But most of the organisms that we call animals on Earth will fit into one of these 9 phyla. So let's go ahead and check those out. And this is really, if you guys like this stuff, if you love this stuff, which I love this stuff, this is one of my favorite classes as well in college. If you like it, it's zoology, okay? And if you're interested in pursuing it, I would definitely recommend pursuing zoology. You can get so many cool careers out of zoology. You can study, there's just so many animals you can study. You can do research projects all across the world. Some of the coolest scientists I've known were zoologists, So anyway, think about that. If you're interested in zoology or want to take zoology, definitely consider it, because you'll be talking about these. So the 9 phyla, let's go over them. So porifera, this includes our sponges. Sponges are not just the things you wipe down your countertops and toilets with. Sponges are also living organisms. They're the only asymmetrical living organism, which means that if you were to cut them straight down the middle, they wouldn't have exact symmetry on each side, which is weird to think about, because even here you might think, oh, that looks pretty symmetrical, but it never is, never quite symmetrical. And these guys right here, of course, no matter which way you cut them, they're never going to be exactly alike on the side. They are called aquatic filter feeders because what they do is they basically suck water in through all the sponge material. All of the nutrients and stuff get trapped inside there, and then that's how they eat them. They kind of diffuses through their cells and everything, and then they spit back out the filtered water. They have cells that have cilia on them. If you remember, the cilia are from, we learned about those when we talked about protist movement, and they're the little hairs on the outside of the cells that are going to constantly sort of be drawing the water in. So they're just working overtime to just kind of pull the water in, like little turbines, and they filter out the nutrients. So asymmetrical phyla, filter feeders, really cool, very ancient. Okay, porifera have been around for a very long time. It's a very simple animal body structure, and the scientists think it's one of the first to have evolved from those amoeba-like organisms. They are, in fact, non-motile. However, their earliest stages are motile, and they decide where to go. Once they land and they root, they're non-motile. Cnidaria. So Cnidaria are jellyfish or jellies. I grew up saying jellyfish, but now jellies is the new accepted term. Jellyfish is more antiquated, mostly because it's just not as accurate, and scientists were like, we need a better term. So jellies. You might not think that's a better term, but whatever. Cnidaria are named for these awesome cells called cnidocytes that are basically spring-loaded toxic barbs that are inside their cells, and upon feeling pressure, there's actually a little catch, and the catch releases, the barb shoots out, stabs into its victim, and injects them with a dose of toxin, which can range from just discomfort, mild discomfort, to death in the case of certain jellies, which is pretty cool. So Cnidaria, of course, they don't all sting. Not all of them are going to have that toxic barb, but a lot of them do. It's how they hunt, and they're able to catch their prey, or they might not all have a toxic barb that affects you very much or whatever. But anyway, so the lack of centralized nervous system. This is something sponges don't have a nervous system at all. Jellies do have a nervous system, but it's not centralized. So in other words, when we talk about nervous system, it's really just talking about how, the sort of central electric system, if you want to talk about it that way, that's going to kind of communicate between the organism's limbs and its quote-unquote brain. Now, jellies don't have a centralized nervous system, so they don't have a brain at the center that's like a control center, but they do have a nerve net. So going all through their bodies, they have these little rings and nets of nerves that are going to send signals and communicate between what's happening with their tentacles and what's happening with their body and all that stuff, and that's kind of how they keep track of where they are and what they're doing. Jellies are also absolutely ancient in the earliest oceans, way back when. Like way back when, hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago, far before, probably, we'll say 600 to 700 million years ago, jellies were just floating around in the ocean. I mean, they have been around since the beginning of life as we would recognize it. And they're just absolutely incredible, very simple organisms. They usually hunt using their long tentacles. They snag stuff and they bring it up, and they eat it. So just really, really cool. Their symmetry is called radial. This means that if we were to go ahead and cut them, and if we were to kind of look straight down on the head of a jellyfish and cut, no matter what angle we chose to cut, as long as we cut, down through the center of the jellyfish, we would have two symmetrical sides. So it's basically like the old saying that you can't, if you look at a circle and you cut it straight down the middle, no matter what angle you cut it at down the middle, it'll always have equal sides, and that's basically what radial symmetry is. Platyhelminths or helminthes. So platyhelminthes is the flatworms, and these guys, I actually really, really love these guys. And a lot of why I love these guys is because of a weird experiment that was done to show that so this is crazy. They can regrow their heads, which is wild, and they do have a centralized nervous system. They have little nerve ganglia at the very top, like where their head is, and so it's not like it's a very rudimentary form of a quote unquote brain. It's not quite a brain, but it's getting there. And if you cut that off, they can still remember how to solve mazes. So you can like train them to solve mazes, and then you can cut off their head. They'll regrow a new head, completely new brain. And they'll remember how to solve the maze. And so they don't store their memories in their brain, which is it's like one of the coolest pieces of research that's going on right now, to try to figure out how the heck are they remembering how to do this without a brain? Like, they got rid of their brain. But anyway, these guys are really, really cool. They have a ladder-like nervous system, which means that they have like nerve ganglia up here in the head, and then major nerves that run down parallel through the body, and then minor nerves that kind of connect them like the rungs of a ladder. So a lot of these guys are kind of unknown. Some people have seen these guys, which are these aquatic platyhelminthes. These are my favorite, which are planarians. And this is not a great picture, but they have these derpy little eye spots that are very rudimentary sense organs, like eyes, which can see light, and they're really wonderful. They have also, their mouth is down here somewhere, which is really, really wild. It's like a tube that extends. And so we could see more complex functions here. We have some more complex nervous systems, centralization of the nervous system, and these sense organs. This is the head over here. This is the head of a tapeworm, which is maybe one of the more famous platyhelminthes. You can get these. They latch onto your gut using this crazy device on their head that's called a scolex, if I'm remembering correctly. It latches into your intestine, and then they feed off of the food you eat, and they can grow really freaking long. It's really disgusting and gross, but they're also really cool. So anyway, I hope I never get one, but they're really fascinating. Then we have nematodes, which are roundworms. So these are not like the earthworms that you get out of the ground. Roundworms are going to be a little bit different. They have bilateral symmetry, just like platyhelminthes and well, wait, these are the only two really that we talked about. But these roundworms, they're everywhere. I mean, nematodes are one of the most diverse and common organisms on the planet. It's actually been said that if you were to get rid of everything, if you were to just get rid of buildings and all solid matter and everything, but just leave the nematodes, you could actually still see cities, landscapes, trees, all that stuff just off the shape of the nematodes that were left. So like crazy numbers of nematodes. Many are parasitic, many are not. They perform a lot of really important functions in the microscopic worlds of, you know, just various different food chains and food webs. Some can be seen with the naked eye, but they are very, very small. As you can see, these are microscope images right here. They do have a centralized nervous system, but they have a ring-shaped rather than a ladder-shaped nervous system, and they have a tissue level organization, which is more complex cell organization and internal body cavity. Annelids are going to be like your earthworms, your polychaetes, which are going to be your bristle worms. These oftentimes live in the ocean floor and stuff. And then you're going to have leeches. Ew. Okay, so these guys are more complex. They have segmented bodies, which better allows them to regulate the control of different movements, musculature and otherwise. They have a more advanced digestive tract. They have rudimentary eyes and things like that that they can see through, and they have more centralized organ systems. So like worms will have a more centralized system where their quote-unquote hearts are, and they have a more centralized nerve system as well. So we're getting more and more complex. Arthropods are going to be insects and crustaceans. So this includes a huge range of organisms. They are bilaterally symmetrical, which means if I was to cut this crab down the middle, you know, there would be even parts on either side. Same with the butterflies, same with the caterpillar, etc. And they contain a more centralized nervous system with more advanced eyes in eye ganglia, or nerve bundles rather. They have specialized appendages for doing different tasks, so some for landing, some for cutting, like these crabs, chelipeds, they're little chompers, they're little, whatever you want to call those. They have, you know, specialized limbs for jumping and all this other sort of, or from climbing and stuff. So those specialized limbs, they have segmented bodies and a hard exoskeleton that allows for the attachment of muscles to have these various different ways of moving around. So more and more complex as we go. Echinoderms. Okay, so echinoderms are wild. They actually move not using an internal or external skeleton that's hard, but they use something called a hydroskeleton. So they change the water pressure in their limbs, which makes it so that their limbs actually move them around, which is really, really freaking cool. They are both bilaterally and radially symmetric, which means that if I was to cut the starfish straight down here, I would have two equal halves. If I was to cut it down here, I'd have two equal halves. If I was to cut it down here, I'd have two equal halves. And so it's radial, but it's also bilateral because I could cut it here and it would have two equal halves like that. And they come in all different forms and shapes and sizes. Really, really wild organisms. And then we have chordates. Chordates are going to be most of the animals that you guys recognize, like things that you have seen outside. Most of the animals that we talk about are chordata. They are bilaterally symmetrical. They have a notochord, which is going to support their quote-unquote backbone when they're very young and developing. They have pharyngeal gill slits, which if you look at most embryos, you see little like gills forming and stuff like that. And then they have post-anal tails. Now you're like, where's human tails? Well, we lose our tails. Most of us lose our tails as we're being born. There are some people that are born with tails, and they're usually surgically removed. But you can see most animals will have these tails. Many of the animals that we interact with are going to be these. A lot of them are vertebrates. They have backbones. Not all of them are going to be vertebrates. Some are going to be invertebrates. This is an example. This is a tunicate, which is a really strange chordate. It does have all the stuff though, so it's really weird. It actually looks a little bit like a living embryo if you kind of look at it that way. But anyway, so this is going to be the ones that we typically think about when we think about animals. So those are the 9 major phyla of animals. Really incredible diversity, beautiful, beautiful structures, and it's cool to go through them and see how evolution kind of became more and more complex over time. Not better, but more complex. So what do animals do for us today? Well, obviously they make up a lot of the heterotrophs on Earth, so they help to balance that predator-prey relationship and keep populations in check. They pass energy along trophic systems and food and allow for a lot of diversity. And they also provide a lot of food for billions of people. So we have, huge, obviously these livestock um, herds of cattle and things like that that feed us with our hamburgers and pigs for pork and chicken for chicken, obviously, and all that sort of stuff. And then, of course, they work alongside people. So not just being, workhorses or donkeys and stuff, but also, we have them as therapy animals and we have them as, rescue animals and stuff like that. And of course, they keep us company at home. I have a little fluff nugget on the couch over there, and she's asleep or maybe listening to me. I'm not sure. But they're wonderful. They're great companions, and they're dogs are people's best friend, right? So anyway, there's something really cool about animals that seems to remind us of our own humanity. And sometimes, when you see a dog do something or cat do something or I don't know, elephants or just any animal do something that seems kind of human, it's kind of eerie and cool because you're like, wow, I have this kinship with this thing that I don't really understand. That's really special. And so I think that's really what touches us about a lot of animals. And I'm an avid bird watcher. I go out into the woods all the time and watch birds, and I'm constantly amazed by their ingenuity, their social interactions, and just how they behave around each other and around people. So I definitely get it. If your favorite kingdom is Animalia, I don't discredit you whatsoever. I might stick with Plante, but I can definitely appreciate the opinion that the animal kingdom is just one of the most incredible things on the face of the earth. Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this. I always love talking about zoology. I hope you guys enjoyed the exploration, and yeah, if you're interested in zoology, definitely pursue it, because this is such a cool field, and all the zoologists that I know are so passionate and in love with what they do. Okay, guys, hope you stay safe, stay well, and enjoy your days.